Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and this new episode is on Calvin Coolidge and the Centennial of Vermont Presidential Inauguration, which we will be noting on August 2nd. Our previous show was on the last summer of Warren G. Harding, because in order for us to appreciate the role of the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, we needed to precede it with that of Warren Harding. And as someone who started teaching history, United States history, over 40 years ago, I can share with you that my own perspectives on Calvin Coolidge have changed. One of the things that I think I succumbed to at that time is reducing Calvin Coolidge to a bit of a caricature, because there's so much about him that he lived up to his reputation as being a man of few words, and certainly in the era that followed him, there was a lot of cynicism about him, his thriftness, his old-time values. However, over the passage of time, and this is why we have historical perspective, I see things a lot differently. I see Calvin Coolidge through a different prism than I did as a young teacher. For one thing that changes the picture a great deal, I've outlived him by several years already. But as we look back, not only on the Coolidge, Vermont inauguration, I think it's important for us to take another look at this man, to hear him in his own words. I will be spending some time reading from Calvin Coolidge's autobiography, which is really eloquently written. He may not have been a man of a great many words, but he chose his words very carefully. Our primary focus for this show during this time is the absolutely unique occurrence in Vermont history when Calvin Coolidge happened to be home on vacation in Vermont, visiting his father in Plymouth Notch, when his father, who was a notary, received the telegram that Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, had died in San Francisco. And through the Constitution, it meant that Calvin Coolidge, as the Vice President, needed to be sworn in as quickly as possible. This is unique in the annals of presidential history, that the father of a president would swear in his own son. There was no photograph that commemorated this event. This is a composite picture that was made. There's also an oil painting of this, but the composite photograph is a little bit truer to life. And for people who visit the Coolidge homestead in Plymouth, Vermont, the parlor is little changed. A day and a half later, you can read the headlines in the Rutland Herald, and here is just a little bit of what the Rutland Herald said about this. Calvin Coolidge takes the oath of office by pale light of kerosene lamp. President is sworn in by his father, who is notary. Public at 2 o'clock in the morning. The new executive shaves himself in the kitchen sink as natives look through the window, and later a photo is taken under the trees. So this is something that is an absolute storybook happening in Vermont history. So let's go back in time to Calvin Coolidge, born on the 4th of July, 1872, in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, to John Coolidge and his wife, Victoria Josephine Moore. Unusual for the time, he was one of only 2 children born to this couple. And to read a little bit from his autobiography, one of the events that significantly shaped his personality was the early death of his mother. He thus describes some of his ancestry. On the side of her father, Hiram Dunlop Moore was Scotch and a mixture of Welsh and English. Her mother, Abigail Franklin Moore, was chiefly of old New England stock. She bore the name of 2 empresses, Victoria and Josephine. She was of a very light and fair complexion with a rich growth of brown hair that had a glint of gold in it. Her hands and features were regular and finely modeled. The older people told me how beautiful she was in her youth. She was practically an invalid ever after I could remember her, but she used what strength she had in the lavish care upon me and my sister, who was 3 years younger. There was a touch of mysticism and poetry in her nature, which made her love to gaze at purple sunsets and watch the evening stars. Whatever was grand and beautiful in form and color attracted her. It seemed as though the rich green tints of the foliage and the blossoms of the flowers came for her in the springtime, and in the autumn it was for her that the mountainsides were struck with crimson and gold. When she knew that her end was near, she called us children to her bedside, where we knelt down to receive her final blessing. In an hour she was gone. It was her 39th birthday. I was 12 years old. We laid her away in the blustering snows of March. The greatest grief that can come to a boy came to me. Life was never to seem the same again. And when you hear just how poignant that is, this is an instance that Calvin Coolidge really does not deserve to be known only by the name of Silent Cal. He was educated in Ludlow, Vermont. He attended for a year of prep school at St. John's Berry Academy, and this in turn prepared him to go to Amherst, where he graduated in 1895. He soon moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, and began a steady rise in local politics. And certainly the next significant event in his life that would define him and thereby provide a contrast to his own personality is when he married Grace Goodhue of Burlington, who is our only First Lady to be an alumna of the University of Vermont. We have here, next to the picture of the young Calvin, the clipping from the Burlington Free Press on the 5th of October, 1905, that describes their wedding. It was a very quiet wedding at the home of the bride's father. This is what it has to say about Mr. Coolidge. Mr. Coolidge is one of the most prominent lawyers in Northampton. He is a native of this state, having been born in Plymouth. He was graduated from Amherst College in the class of 1895, and since then has lived in Northampton, where he is chairman of the Republican City Committee and a member of the Hampshire County Bar. As Calvin Coolidge continued to rise to political fame, he was elected as governor of Massachusetts in 1918. We can see here a picture of him and Grace at a baseball game. Calvin Coolidge was a great baseball fan, and Grace all the more so. Grace was an avid Red Sox fan. At right, we have a campaign pamphlet for Coolidge as governor, and it says that he is a sturdy American, believer in Massachusetts, a man who practices what he preaches, a square deal to all, make him governor. And it was really after some prompting that Coolidge took a stand in the Boston police strike in 1919 that essentially the police did not have a right to strike anywhere at any time. And this stance on law and order at a time when there were real fears of anarchy in the country, this is what propelled him more than anything else into the national spotlight. We have next a film clip of the Coolidge family in 1919. And as we look at this newsreel from the Library of Congress, one of the things that I think will strike you is this was a young family, because Coolidge himself was only 46 years old. We have Grace, always ebullient and smiling, and we have their two children, John, the eldest, and Calvin Jr. We'll have a little bit more to say in a bit about Calvin Jr. And once again, it's a wonderful thing that we have readily accessible film to show how these people come alive. So now we have images of Calvin Coolidge that would become part of the mystique. He, while he lived in Northampton, Massachusetts from the time that he was a young man, he came home to the family farm in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. And back then, when people stayed for a stretch of vacation, he just didn't sit and read. So these are among the widely publicized images of Coolidge helping out on his father's farm. The image at right shows some of the various celebrities that stopped by to visit at the Coolidge farm. So we have Harvey Firestone, Henry Ford, and the man holding a straw hat next to Grace Coolidge is none other than Thomas Edison. We also have a film clip that shows how visiting round at Coolidge Corners, Vermont, became something that entered the American mystique. As we look at these images, we're very fortunate to see how little of the landscape has changed. And Plymouth Notch, Vermont, and the village looks very much the same as it did during the time that John Coolidge, the president's father, lived there. There has been the addition of a wonderful presidential library and visitors center, but the home where Calvin Coolidge grew up, where he was sworn in his first oath of office, the post office, the general store, all of those things remain as they were at the time that the Coolidges lived there. I should add, as we look at these scenes, we are at a real crossroads in America, because for the first time at the time that the 1920 census was taken, the number of people who lived in American cities exceeded for the first time the number of people who lived in the country. And this demographic change was part of the general unease that swept through the 1920s. The other thing that I need to go back to is that when we look at the Coolidge presidency in juxtaposition to the Warren Harding administration, which towards the end was rife with corruption. This is when the moral probity, the absolute stark morality of Calvin Coolidge really came out. He was the genuine article. So we have here, I think, at the same time that the United States is roaring away in the 1920s, a perceived perception of lawlessness and prohibition, fast lifestyle, there was something very comforting, something very assuring that after the scandals were starting to break in the Harding administration, that there would be something reassuring, something that would be stabilizing about the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. One of the reasons why Plymouth Notch is so synonymous with Calvin Coolidge, it is also an indication of the values, the Protestant work ethic values, thrift, frugality, that this is something that really molded the political philosophy of Calvin Coolidge. He was someone who firmly believed in self-reliance. He was someone that certainly believed in the laissez-faire version of economics, that it was not the place of the government to intervene in the economy, let the invisible hand take care of it. Also, it was not the domain of the federal government to intervene except in times of national emergency. So for the most part, Coolidge was fortunate to be president during a time, at least for many, but not for all, a time of national prosperity. It would have been very, very different for him to have been president only a short time after he left office, when the weight of the Depression fell on his successor, Herbert Hoover. And here we have some pictures of Grace Coolidge looking at the flowers around the Coolidge homestead. And I think in the interest of time, having seen all that we need to see of the Coolidge family, we will go on to the next parts of the presentation. We have this image at times that Coolidge was rather a dour and sour man, and when we see him throwing out the ball here at a baseball game, we know that he was much more animated than some people remember him. This is a very typical image of Coolidge at his office, and what I think is remarkable is how neat and tidy his desk is. Pictures here of the Coolidge family, and they both liked pets, and Grace in particular liked collies. In the juxtaposition of these two portraits, it tells us a lot about their differences as couples. So in this marvelous full-length portrait of Grace Coolidge, painted by Howard Chandler Christie, we can see Grace with her collie, who was named Rob Roy, one of several. She looks very elegant, with the south facade of the White House in the background. She loved clothes. She was especially stylish. And even though Calvin could be very, very thrifty, he always indulged Grace in having beautiful clothes. So while he probably wore his shoes out until there were holes in the sole, we always see Grace beautifully attired. We have a presidential portrait here of Calvin Coolidge, one of several. This is one by an artist that we don't hear much about. His name was Charles S. Hopkinson, and I think it captures some of the gravity of Calvin Coolidge. And I would dare say that the inspiration for this painting of Coolidge sitting in a Windsor chair was inspired by Ralph Earl's portrait of Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman, who was a key player in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and Roger Sherman is seated in a similar position in a Windsor chair. A lovely picture on the balcony of the White House of the Coolidge family, a reminder that they were a young family. So at this time, behind the president is Calvin Jr., who is 16 years old, and behind Mrs. Coolidge is John. And John, who did a great deal to keep the legacy of his parents alive, John lived until the year 2000. He lived to be 96. And one of the things that I think is so sad about the life of Calvin Coolidge is that in 1924, his son Calvin Jr., whom we see here at right, was playing tennis on the south lawn of the White House. He suffered a blister that went septic, and he died of blood poisoning. And in 1924, we have to remember that this is 2 years before the discovery of penicillin, and when infections became seriously septic like this, there wasn't a great deal that could be done about it. And this, I think, is something that just darkened the remaining portion of Calvin Coolidge's life. And I would like to read to you, it's a very moving part from his autobiography about the impact of the death of his son. He was talking about some of the partisan meetings during his re-election and the election of 1924, when he was elected as president in his own right. And he writes, "My own participation was delayed by the death of my son Calvin, which occurred on the 7th of July. He was a boy of much promise, proficient in his studies, with a scholarly mind, who had just turned 16. He had a remarkable insight into things. The day I became president, he had just started to work in a tobacco field. When one of his fellow laborers said to him, 'If my father was president, I would not work in a tobacco field,' Calvin replied, 'If my father were your father, you would.' After he was gone, someone sent us a letter he had written about the same time to a young man who had congratulated him on being the first boy in the land. To this he had replied that he had done nothing and so did not merit the title, which should go to some boy who had distinguished himself through his actions. We do not know what might have happened to him under other circumstances, but if I had not been president, he would not have raised a blister on his toe, which resulted in blood poisoning, playing lawn tennis on the South grounds. In his suffering, he was asking me to make him well. I could not. When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." Very, very poignant words from a suffering father. And here is how the Rutland Herald headlined some of the information about Calvin Coolidge's death. Coolidge, boy, is laid at rest in hillside grave. Burial of the president's younger son marked by simple but impressive service at Plymouth Village Cemetery, where crowds gather to pay tribute to his memory. And I should add that my maternal grandmother, who was the same age as Calvin Coolidge Jr., this is something that affected many young people in America at the time, to know that someone their age, someone of so well-known a prominence, succumbed to something like a blister. We have here Calvin Coolidge on the way in January of 1925 to his second inauguration. We see Grace in a very stylish outfit, and Calvin Coolidge looking very, very solemn. No assessment of the Coolidge presidency would be complete without at least one editorial cartoon when we see Coolidge with his type of republicanism seeking to prune the waste in government. The most famous words that Coolidge ever uttered came from a speech that he delivered from the back of a train in Bennington after touring when he could get back to Vermont because it lost so many railroad lines in the flood of 1927. And these are the words that have resonated with so many people, and there are many Vermonters that I have known that have chosen these words for their funeral. Vermont is a state I love. I could not look upon the peaks of Ascutney, Killington, and Mansfield and Equinox without being moved in a way that no other scene could move me. It was here that I first saw the light of day. Here I received my bride. Here my dead lie pillowed on the loving breast of our everlasting hills. I love Vermont because of her hills and valleys, her scenery and invigorating climate, but most of all because of her indomitable people. They are a race of pioneers who almost beggared themselves to serve others. If the spirit of liberty should vanish in other parts of the Union and support of our institution should languish, it could all be replenished from the generous store held by the people of this brave little state of Vermont. Coolidge chose simply by saying, I do not wish to run as far as the re-election of 1928. And I think what epitomizes his simplicity is that in the 1930 census, returning to private life in Northampton, here we have the 1930 census, Calvin, Grace, and their housekeeper, but they are living in a rented duplex. And shortly after this census was taken, the Coolidges did buy a more remote house because Calvin was a little bit tired of having people come and gawk at him. Coolidge lived to be only 60 years old. He died in January of 1933. We can see the headline in the Rutland Herald. He had a heart attack. And what I've often thought about is that in the election that preceded his death, the election of November 1932, when Herbert Hoover lost and the country was in a severe economic depression, I think the whole change in government that would ensue from that moment is something that deeply troubled Coolidge. And although he could be stoic at times, we know from the way that he expressed himself that he turned his grief inward. So I believe that he died at a time that he was genuinely concerned for the direction that America was going in. Mrs. Coolidge lived till 1957. She died at the age of 78, and one can see their very simple graves at the cemetery in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. And here we have Calvin Jr., his father, and the grave of Calvin Coolidge. And once again, to fully appreciate the centennial of the Coolidge inauguration, we should make a trip to the Coolidge Center in Plymouth Notch, Vermont.